Welcome to episode 4 of the book of Genesis as we reach the second day of creation in Genesis 1. And so we'll be building today on what we saw last time, where God's first actions were let there be light, and then a separating of the day into night, the light and the darkness. And today we're going to focus on the second day, which is parallel to the fifth day and deals with the waters. And to get a sense of that, let's look at our little chart here that shows the structure of that. So we can see here that the second day here corresponds to the fifth day here, the waters, and then next time the third day of the land will correspond to the dry land. And we'll see the difference here between day one, as we heard last time, and now we'll get in the regular rhythm of the second day, the third day, etc. We'll also note here that the Hebrew word for water here is used 7 times in the second and third days, because water is involved in both. First, on the second day, as we'll look at now, the separating of the waters above into 2 sets of waters, as we'll see, the water above and the water below, and then the separating on the third day of the water on the ground and the dry land. So let's look at our verses here and explore some of this. And this won't take us too long today because it's only 3 short verses, but there's some very important things to look at. So let's jump right in. And so continue our pattern. And then God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." This term "let there be" is the refrain we saw in verse 3, and we'll see that regularly. The great Jewish medieval commentator Rashi notes about this: "Let the separation be strengthened. Even though the heavens had already been created on the first day, they were still liquid. They crystallized on the second day." Again, the Jewish Midrash, whether the ancient Midrash from Genesis Rabbah from the early centuries after the time of Jesus, or the medieval Midrash from Rashi and others a millennium later, are creative, and they're not intended to be factual. They understood the nature of the Genesis text as not stating facts against modern science, but exploring an imaginative version of how things are, but that resonates with people's experience, as we'll see. So this process of solidifying the liquid, and again, much like scientists would say about the earth, that was liquid and then hardened as it cooled. So they might not have understood the science, but they had some intuitive sense, spiritual sense, if you will, of what was going on. And this term for dome, Hebrew rakia, it's very rare otherwise. It's only in Ezekiel, as you can see, and a Psalm a couple times. It's sometimes known as the firmament, and in the Bible Hub heading here, that's not part of the text, of course, that they provide, they say firmament. That comes from the Latin firmamentum here, as a result of the Septuagint from the Greek stereoma, under the influence of Alexandrian series of stone vaults. So I have to take a couple of steps back there to get to the language issues. So if you're not familiar, the Septuagint was written over a course of time, almost certainly in Alexandria, translating the Hebrew Bible into the Greek that was spoken throughout the region after Alexander the Great and his successors imposed Hellenistic culture on the entire area. And so the Greek was the language that the Bible was translated into, Hebrew Bible, but then, of course, Latin of Jerome, centuries later, became the standard, especially in the Catholic Church. And so you get from the Greek stereoma to the Latin firmamentum to the English firmament. As the idea of a stone vault, although the original Hebrew verb, here it says a noun, but the original Hebrew verb suggests to stamp with the feet or to stamp down, to hammer out, much like whether that's a blacksmith with a hammer or people hammering soft metal with their feet into a smooth sheet, as would have been done. So the idea of stamping or hammering out this sheet that is intended to separate the waters above and the waters below. Again, Rashi says here, it's as if God said, "Let there be a canopy." As you can see from the picture I'm posting there on the screen, an older view of what Genesis is conveying as a cosmological expression here suggested that they believed in a flat earth. But modern scholars have really noted that that's not likely, that as far back as the ancient Greeks, who were roughly contemporaneous, although probably not in contact with the Israelites who had been in Jerusalem and now in Babylon, much to the east, away from the Greek cultural exploration that was happening there. Still, at the same time, many people understood, including the Babylonians, that the earth was almost certainly round and not flat. So that older view that the Genesis people believe in a flat earth is almost certainly not true. What we're seeing rather is some kind of separation in the sky. It separates the waters above from the waters below. The verb to separate here, just as we saw above, that God separated the light from the darkness, so there'd be day and night. Now the waters above are separated from the waters below. And of course, we don't necessarily think of it that way, that there's a great river in the sky. We understand meteorologically of how water evaporates and condenses, etc. And yet, do we not meteorologically talk about atmospheric rivers and the Gulf Stream and other forms of flowing water in the sky, which of course there is, contrary to our intuitive sense that it would fall out of the sky. In fact, it doesn't fall out of the sky except on certain occasions. So they might not have understood how that happened, but they certainly understood there was water in the sky that needed to be held up from the ground somehow, and this rakia, or dome, was the basis for separating it. And of course the idea that it opened to provide for the rain and the storms as well. So in the next verse we see, so God made the dome, and this is different than what we saw before. In day 1 we saw God said, let there be light, and there was light, with no specific causal agency being noted. We don't know how that happened, either who God was saying it to, or who or what is responding. Here, God's speaking it like it's an idea, but then has to act directly to make it happen. So God made the dome and separated the waters. So it's here more of a statement of intention than it is an imperative demanding that something else make something happen. So here God speaks and then God makes directly. It doesn't say how God makes it. It doesn't suggest, as we'll see in the garden story in chapter 2, the sense of somehow God scooping up the topsoil and breathing into it, more like a craftsperson. But the implicit meaning of rakia as stamping out may suggest that to readers who are more familiar with that idea than we are. And then, so God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome, and it was so, following that refrain. And then God called the dome sky, and this is a curious translation issue, because in verse 1, we hear God created the heavens, and here we hear it's sky, but it's the same word, shemayim. Here that's translated heaven in verse 1, or translated as sky in verse 8. And that can be very misleading for us because of Christian theology especially. We tend to think of the sky as a secular, if you will, or a physical thing, that space above the ground that looks blue when it's clear and white and gray, etc., and has things in it, whether that's the immediate things like birds and air, or the farther things like the storms or the stars and the sun. We tend to think of that as a separate thing from something quote-unquote called heaven, a place where souls go when you die. But the Bible knows nothing about that kind of heaven, and so it really is misleading to translate shemayim sometimes as heaven and sometimes as sky. I think it's disorienting in a really good way to always translate it as sky, so that, as we'll see even in the Hebrew, or in the Greek, oranos, that Jesus would say in the Lord's Prayer, your will be done on earth as it is in the sky, as opposed to on earth as it is in some metaphysical realm separate from the creation we experience. Because what's being named here is a creation that is what people experience. This sky, shemayim, is where the water comes from, and it'll be the place where God puts the sun and the moon as well. So this is not some metaphysical other place. It's simply what you see when you look up. It's really everything that's above the ground is the sky. And something important here to note before I finish for today about how this plays out against Enuma Elish, and how it also plays out against any other cosmological mythologies that were common in that time and region, whether that's Egypt off to the south, or the local Canaanites, or the Greeks and the Romans later, as we'll see when we look at New Testament texts in another series, this show, this Radical Bible program here. Which is to say that God is just treating the sky and the rain as just things that are made, as opposed to, say, Baal, the storm god, the Canaanite storm god, and popular throughout the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean. This sense of the riders on the storm and the Jim Morrison song by the Doors, or that sense of a powerful force that's divine, that brings lightning and thunder like Zeus or Jupiter in Greco-Roman mythology. But there is no storm god here, and there's also no ocean god, as in the Inu Malicious Tiamat, the salt water being powerful force. And we'd see that in Psalms as well, that remnant of a mythological force of the ocean, some kind of deity in opposition to God. But there's nothing of that here. There's just simply water, inanimate water that's separated by God into two different bodies of water. And so then there's evening and morning, and now we have the traditional second day, as opposed to day one. And so now these days will have parallels. Day one will have parallel with day four too, but as the created things, as opposed to the light itself, we'll see those parallels more explicitly. So that's day two, our second day, and that will flow directly, pun intended there in terms of water, into the separating of the water from the land. So stay tuned for the next episode.